Ever since I graduated, I was always drawn to the concept of financial independence, like a moth to a flame. Fast forward about half a decade, and I'm currently there. Well, at least technically, on paper. However, it's left me feeling bittersweet, with more questions than answers. I've thought a lot about this topic in my head, so I figured it's worthwhile documenting it, whether you're thinking of starting on your journey or on your way there. To address the elephant in the room, since I'm sure you're wondering, no, unfortunately, I'm not a big shot tech bro or finance bro with a massive pay package. In fact, I'm just an average dude with a normal 5-figure salary job. And no, I don't have 7 figures in net worth. Actually, I'm still quite a distance away. So how am I financially independent, you ask? Well, let me explain. I've done okay in the markets, which I will cover later. With my current lifestyle, assuming I park my net worth in the S&P 500 index, and assuming it returns the average of the past decade, the average return on it will be twice my annual expenses. To put simply, if I quit my job today, I'll be able to more than maintain my current level of lifestyle and spending. So in the pure sense, I have technically achieved financial independence, which is genuinely awesome. I'm super thankful for it, and I don't take any of what I currently have for granted. However, at the same time, I'm also struggling on a number of topics, which I will cover. But first, let me provide some context on why the concept of financial independence has been so important to me. I think this all kicked off with my internship in college. This was really my first glimpse and wake-up call into the real world, and my first experience being separated from peers of my own age group. I'm certainly not saying this applied to everyone, but a good portion of people I could just tell were miserable inside. Now, maybe that's being too harsh, but I think you get my point. For most people, it was just the means to put food on the table, and I'm certainly not judging or knocking them for that at all. While I was thinking through this rather gloomy topic as an intern, I would go on to have a conversation that literally and genuinely changed my life. As I look back on my life, this is no doubt one of the most influential and pivotal moments that helped shape me into who I am today. Looking back, it was a mixture of being at the right place, at the right time, with the right mindset. So let's talk about it. This conversation was with a coworker from a different department. We had bonded over time through playing table tennis together on our breaks. Even before our conversation, this person, as the kids nowadays would say, had massive aura. Even a dumb college kid like me can notice it back then. It's hard to quantify and put it into words, but simply put, you could tell he was genuinely at peace, radiated positive vibes, and had no ego in terms of thinking he was better than you. I hadn't thought much about it initially, aside from, wow, this person is really awesome to be around. And wow, he's really cool. I want to be like him in terms of how he carries himself. Well, fast forward towards the end of my internship, I guess somehow my dumbass must have made an impression on him. He would go on to confide something in me that he hadn't told anyone else at work. And it was this conversation that totally changed my life. He brought up the fact that he had been working for the same company since graduating. He's definitely on the younger side. If I had to guess, probably late 30s. This is important context for later. Anyway, he would go on to mention that he sacrificed and saved as much as he could every month ever since he started working, and piled all the excess savings into real estate rentals. It started off with one property and compounded from there. Needless to say, bro had beyond enough to retire. You can imagine my surprise. Here is a relatively young-looking dude with enough money to retire multiple times over. It just didn't compute with me and broke a lot of the programming that I had developed up until that point. For context, growing up, my parents for a good period of time were working minimum wage basic factory jobs or restaurant jobs just to keep food on the table. For me, the couple takeaways were as follows. The reason he had so much aura was because he was doing what he genuinely wanted to do. And that, in my opinion, is the ultimate goal and calling that we should all strive to achieve with the little time we have on this giant floating rock. I think a great visual representation is the following clip of Joe Hisaishi being totally immersed. However, after reflecting upon it, that freedom also meant that my coworker was able to be true to himself and his values. This meant he didn't need to put up with any bullshit at work versus someone living paycheck to paycheck with no other options. You can imagine how different their mindsets and perspectives would be. Third, and probably most importantly, is the value of saving early on in life to take advantage of compounding, as well as going in with size and conviction. The normie logic would be to dismiss his success and chalk it up to luck. The more nuanced take is he just did what pretty much most self-made successful people had done. Saw an opportunity and went in heavy. This applies to both entrepreneurship and investing. That said, there's certainly survivorship bias to be mindful of. In an alternate universe, real estate values could have tanked, and his leverage would have ended up getting him liquidated and bankrupt. Putting wealth aside, even before he had shared this story with me, I looked up to him and recall telling myself, wow, he has a lot of great traits. I should work on myself to get better. My overall point being, I think it is difficult to have a truly authentic and meaningful life without financial independence. That's just my opinion anyway. Especially in today's climate of corporate layoffs and expensive housing, us young folks are climbing an increasingly steep uphill battle. As someone on the very tail end of a millennial, I think my generation and future generations are pretty cooked. Without going into the details, since that could be multiple videos in itself, just know that our system is, for better or worse, built on debt, and that this very system is intentionally designed so that your money is worth less and less every year. In simple terms, it's a hidden tax on the less well-off, as it means that the items will be going up in price every year, from food to housing to assets, which wouldn't be a big deal if the typical salary matched or exceeded this pace of inflation. However, it doesn't and hasn't for a very long time. In other words, if you own assets, you are benefiting from the system. If you don't, you are getting left behind because they are only getting more and more expensive, and it is only going to get harder and harder to dig yourself out of the hole. Therefore, the divide between the two classes will continue to widen as long as our current debt-based fractional reserve system is in place. In fact, it's already at a point where it's hard to catch up. Take me, for instance. I've been living like a broke student ever since I graduated to keep expenses low and piled money into the markets. I've also had my fair share of luck and small success. Even despite this lifestyle, which most people would find repulsive, and some success in the markets, I cannot afford a house because they're going for 7 figures plus. Yes, I'm talking even with a mortgage. But let's say you are someone in the fortunate position to afford this hypothetical house. The next question is, can you really afford it, and is it worth it? You'd likely be taking on an excessively large mortgage, which will translate to you practically living paycheck to paycheck. Is that really worth the risk and stress in this economy where people are losing their jobs to AI and corporate incentives, while finding new jobs is becoming increasingly more difficult? Not to mention, it would mean you'd be missing out on the AI upside of being invested in the markets. Is that really worth it? It's no wonder why a meaningful portion of my generation and the younger generation have largely given up. How can we even think of starting a family when simple things like housing has become so out of reach? This problem has given rise to the mainstream cultural phenomenons on the two tail ends of the extremes. On the one hand, there is the lying flat crowd in the East and the anti-work/quiet quitting crowd in the West, where the younger people have largely given up advancing their careers, because they see that the additional income is not worth the additional effort, given how out of reach basic things like housing still is. To quote Charlie Munger, "Show me the incentive and I'll show you the outcome." On the opposite end is the rise of mainstream gambling. While there are people on there that genuinely struggle with addiction and need help, I reckon the large majority are on there because they see how hard it'll be to catch up to the lifestyle of the previous generation, and came to the conclusion that excessively risky bets is probably the only feasible way out, which I just think is so sad and tragic. Not from a perspective of me looking down on them, but rather I'm sympathetic and can relate to a certain extent. Furthermore, if AI and humanoid robotics develop how I think it will over these next couple of decades, I'm confident this wealth gap is going to widen significantly more between the haves and have-nots. specifically shareholders of these AI companies versus those that are not invested in the markets. At that point, I think UBI is basically all but guaranteed, in my opinion, to prevent massive riots and discourse between the classes. We've seen this story play out time and time again in history, but I digress. On the topic of market and struggles, I feel like I am at a metaphorical crossroad right now. One path is a safer, more conservative option, where I just convert everything into broad index funds and call it a day. The second option is to continue down my current path of taking on additional risk for potentially higher return. That said, if I could just duplicate the year I've had in 2025 for 2026, I will cross 7 figures. That's super trippy for me to say out loud because the younger me would have never foreseen this. This isn't a flex, as I do not take these returns for granted, and I do not let these returns define me. I'm not going to take on negative EV risk just to reach a dumb, meaningless, artificial numbers sooner. Also, I think it'd be fun to actually journal my progress and thoughts in real time, as opposed to writing the book after everything's done and the ending is finalized. Where is the fun in that? I think the fun is in the journey and the progress, not the ending. In fact, one of my favorite things back during the lockdown was to watch a couple of YouTubers who shared their portfolios and journey to financial independence. It was a lot of fun, but unfortunately, they are no longer active, which I'm still pretty bummed about. Speaking of which, I've seen cases of people much smarter than me develop an ego when it comes to the markets due to their profession or success elsewhere. And they've all been humbled with almost no exception. In fact, I experienced that in 2022. I thought I was a hotshot and had it all figured out. It was a very expensive lesson, but I'm really glad I learned it 2 years after starting, as opposed to in my 30s and 40s when there is much more at stake. As Kendrick would say, sit down, be humble. Honestly, it's tough for me right now because I feel like I'm stuck in no man's land. I'm at a level where a wrong move with size will set me back multiple years of savings working a 9 to 5, which I don't think I still fully comprehend nor appreciate. Of course, the inverse is also true. That is literally how I view money at this stage in my life. It directly translates into the most precious resource we will never get any more of, and that is time. The irony to all this is I already know the answer deep down, and that is to take the third path, a mix of both. It reminds me of teachings from Nietzsche, as well as a powerful quote related to the concept of free will and how we are ultimately all condemned to be ourselves. If I weren't Alexander, I'd like to be Diogenes. That is to say, I enjoy this shit way too much to go full boomer index mode. Although it is at times very stressful, it's just too fun and intellectually stimulating for me to full on quit. This is the most complex game humans have ever invented, with some of the smartest people, highest stakes, incentives, and payoffs. I just think it's beautiful. In fact, I used to religiously browse Wall Street bets daily for a full year before I even had a brokerage account. I really enjoyed reading the DDs and seeing how they would play out. In fact, I remember someone had a well-written post on CrowdStrike back in Feb 2020 about how they were the best corporate cybersecurity company. Another example is a lengthy DD that was written on the upcoming memory shortage due to the AI demand. This was a year ago before memory companies pumped to the moon. Those gigabrains are probably retired by now. Anyway, I digress. I've asked myself this question for some time now. If I had all the money in the world, what would I be doing? Because let's be real, retirement sounds great and all, but it gets boring real fast. I think for most of us, we need meaning and purpose in life. The conclusion I've arrived at is I think what I'm already doing on this YouTube channel. First is to share any opportunities I find that's interesting. Not because I want you to pump up my bags, but simply because I enjoy this shit way too much to keep my excitement all to myself. Also, if I'm being honest, from a pride perspective, there's few things that feel as great as being right and to have called it beforehand. Yes, it's a bit egotistical, but it's the truth. To expand on this, I recall some of the most fun I had as a kid was playing Chinese chess with my grandpa. I was totally drawn and loved the strategy aspect of the game. And speaking of games, fast forward a decade, and I found myself totally engrossed in another game, RuneScape. I hated the PvP aspect because it gave me a lot of anxiety and didn't particularly enjoy the grind to reach max level. But what I loved was the grand exchange dynamics and finding asymmetric bets. For instance, I remember merching and buying up supplies ahead of the first ever bonus EXP weekend they held because I knew people would be rushing to buy up these supplies to level up their skills during the bonus weekend. I ended up exiting the bulk of my supplies near the peak a couple days leading up to the bonus weekend when everyone was FOMOing and paying a significant premium. Other examples were more creative, like there would be rare boss drop items that were near high alch value or were super discounted because they had little to no use at the time. I would do my research and then go ham buying up a large chunk of these quote-unquote trash items that no one wanted because of the asymmetry they offered. Worst case, I'd lose like maybe 10%. Best case, and this happened a few times, is that the developers would go on to buff said trash items, or even the very notion of people speculating they would be buffed. And because of the supply dynamics, given the rarity of some of these boss drop items, meant they often skyrocketed in value. I guess I was an OG Grand Exchange Bets member before that was even a thing. Man, honestly, there's so many awesome, fun RuneScape stories that translate into the real world. I should really dedicate an entire video to it. Okay, back to the topic of purpose. I think second, and perhaps more importantly, is to give back. And if I could just help a couple of people, I'll be happy. This is because I remember when I first started my journey, I felt pretty isolated since many of the finance channels I felt were targeted towards a different audience. So I'm just gonna do my own thing. In conclusion, I finally reached financial independence with a huge asterisk. I'm currently in no man's land right now, just barely enough savings for basic financial independence, but not quite there yet, especially if I want to eventually start a family. Will this regard butcher his future, or will he achieve his goals? Well, find out how his journey unfolds on the next few episodes of Dragon Ball Z. As a side note, I love to connect with like-minded people with similar goals and interests. Please feel free to add me on X and leave a comment. Cheers.